Lots of familiar names.
All right, I will go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Carney, and I'm the Social Media Committee Chair for CBDNA and the Assistant Director of Bands at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I hope everyone is happy, safe, and healthy. I know we're kind of in a strange time right now. On behalf of the CBDNA Social Media Committee and the CBDNA's President, Dr. Mark Speed, I welcome you to the latest installment of the CBDNA webinar series. Tonight's webinar is entitled From Paper to Published, a primer on the research process from idea to publication. I'm excited to welcome today's panelists. Dr. John Locke, Director of Bands Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and editor for the Journal of Band Research, and Dr. Jason Nam, Associate Director of Bands at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. The panel discussion will be led by current graduate wind conductors and moderators from the Graduate Wind Conducting Facebook group, Isaac Brinberg from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Angie Hamada from Northwestern University. A few matters of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the event, please type them in the chat window. Our presenters have reserved time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions. A quick note about the private chat so we don't have any embarrassing situations. Private chat has been disabled, so anything you type in the chat box will be visible to everyone. And the session is being recorded, and the video will be archived on the CBDNA YouTube channel. I'll place the link to the channel in the chat window. Now, without further ado, please welcome our distinguished panel.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces here and more people joining us along the way. And thank you so much, Dr. Kearney, for your introductions. So why don't we just go ahead and hop right into it with our first question for panelists. And again, thank you so much to Dr. Locke and Dr. Nam for joining us this evening and taking time out of our busy schedules. So to begin, what are some ways that one formulates a manuscript or research topic? And to add on to that, how do you know your topic is worth potentially submitting to a peer-reviewed journal?
Dr. Locke, would you like to begin?
Sure, if you'd like, that's fine.
Yeah, it sounds great.
I think the first and foremost, when it comes to, we're just talking about a topic now, I think you've got to find something that you're passionate about. And in becoming passionate about any topic, you then literally need to strive to become literally the foremost authority on this topic anywhere, no matter how narrow the focus. And probably to be the foremost authority on anything, your topic and your focus is going to need to be relatively narrow. I think in the case of the Journal of Band Research, which I serve as editor, we're interested in manuscripts in three different topics, or three different broad areas, I should say. The first one is band music, and that should be very familiar to all of you. And this could be a given piece, the music of a given composer, music in a certain time period, the music of a certain country or area of the world. It could be even perhaps, and we've had manuscripts along the lines of that deal with surveys of the literature that's being performed. But before you get any sort of quick and easy ideas, you know, we are not, I can tell you right now, we're not going to be interested in the middle school compositions played and you do the bean counting for it for a 2-year period in the state of Arkansas. That's not going to move the needle really of knowledge. But so band music is one. Band history is another topic, and I wish we had more good manuscripts that came to us that had to do with band history. And I'll probably come back to that point at some point this evening. And the third broad area is what I call band methodology. You would probably think there about the work done by your colleagues or perhaps yourself. I mean, all my degrees are actually in music education, all three of my degrees. And so this could be experimental research done, maybe whether it's method A versus method B, or about surveys of band programs, or how we can help our students achieve more. But those three areas: band music, band history, and band methodology. I would say a place to start for a topic two, perhaps you're doing a master's degree that requires a thesis, and perhaps your thesis could be the beginning point for an article or manuscript, probably only the beginning point. And perhaps if you're in a doctoral program that requires a dissertation, some do, some don't, as you know, that could be an area of focus for you on which you become the expert. Now, this is not to say that you finish your dissertation and you just email it to the Journal of Band Research and we will publish it. I assure you we will not, because there's just too many perfunctory things that you have to have in a dissertation that aren't going to make any sense in a journal. But you could take some aspect of your dissertations, boil it down, or focus on one part of it, and perhaps prepare a manuscript that might be worthy. The other thing is that the other part of this question is it worth submitting to any journal? And that's a tough question. And I would say that my advice is pretty simple here, and that is ask around. Go to your professors at your school. If you have any little bit of music theory in the analysis you've done of someone's piece, you should take it to people in your theory faculty. You should probably send it to people at other schools. Ask around and have people give you an opinion. You could email it to me, and I'd be glad to give you an opinion. This is if the topic is worthy or not. I have one more point, and that is you should also see what's out there. You don't want to make your life's focus or you become the foremost authority on something for which there already is a foremost authority. So you need to know what's out there. I will talk at some point this evening about how to find out what's in the Journal of Band Research. It's really pretty simple, but you should know what's been done in this area or in this topic. Where are the gaps? What do we need to, what might you focus on so that you don't spin your wheels literally and jump on a bunch of aspects that have already been done and done very well by other people. I'll turn it back to Dr. Nam now.
Thank you, Dr. Locke. I want to first say thank you to Angie and Isaac for moderating this session, and also to Josh Kearney for starting us off here on this very important topic. And honestly, it's a topic that I wish that I would have been able to gain some insight into in my graduate school years. And so I feel fortunate that I'm in a position to speak a few of the truths that were, kind of present for me throughout the process as I kind of navigated writing in an academic scholarly style and submitting to various journals. I first of all want to echo the statement that Dr. Locke said in terms of a topic that you choose really does need to come from a place of genuine interest. We all know that in our academic lives going through grad school, maybe you're in a music education program, maybe you are in a conducting program. There's naturally various hoops we need to jump through academically. We need to check off those boxes of those requirements, those certain papers to write, those documents, those dissertations. But I mean, to be perfectly blunt and honest, when you finish music school and you're an assistant professor somewhere, those obligations and those hoops to jump through don't end. You're considering the promotion and tenure process. You're trying to kind of prove your way and provide evidence towards your kind of scholarly activities and research activities. So that being said, that really trying to make sure that it's coming from a genuine place, not just merely out of a place of obligation. Like, I need to jump through this hoop. I need to do something. I need to put a paper out there. I think if you come into it with that mindset, then it's a really fast track to producing a paper that's not very compelling because you don't really feel passionately about it, as Dr. Locke said. I also want to talk about two main points with this question. Is I think the first thing to consider is really when you sit down and maybe even before you consider a topic, to consider what type of paper you're actually writing. In many different sources, certainly some that I've kind of looked through, there's a description of different types of academic writing going from the simple to complex. On the simple end, oftentimes folks will mention what's a style that's called descriptive, which is really just providing facts and information, perhaps summarizing others' findings or summarizing other publications. The next on that spectrum would be analytical papers. So that includes more descriptive writing, but also involves reorganizing of ideas, maybe comparing and contrasting and really kind of digging in a little deeper. And then after analytical writing, there's persuasive writing, which definitely involves more of your individual point of view. You might feel a little bit daunted by this as a new author or a researcher, but as Dr. Locke alluded to, I think it's really important for you to enter into this field, just having that mindset of I am seeking to be an expert in this topic or one of few experts, and to make a really profound contribution. And I think it really begins with that mindset. And last, and probably the most complex of these different types of writing, is the critical style of academic writing, where you're doing a great deal of persuasive writing with like a governing thesis, and you're constantly trying to provide evidence towards that thesis. Basically, the type of writing, argumentative style, thesis-based writing that we're all used to doing in academia, but albeit with a little bit more, perhaps more debate, more comparison, maybe evaluation of multiple points of view. So again, those would be descriptive, analytical, persuasive, and critical. That's sort of how I've framed my mind in thinking about these different styles. I definitely resonate and agree with Dr. Locke too with the types of topics that you might choose. And I might just jump straight onto this kind of sub point of, how does one take a stance and offer a specific point of view when undergoing this process of figuring out what to write? Or maybe you do have a piece that you're interested in writing about, but you're facing like a sea of other research papers. You go onto Realm or JSTOR, and there's just so many other papers written about this topic. So it's really incumbent upon you to try to find some avenue within that larger topic that is unique to your specific point of view and your thesis. So, an example that I kind of came up with was, say if you're writing about Holst Hammersmith, Prelude and Scherzo, obviously a piece that's incredibly important to our repertoire, but the thing is that you need to find some avenue, some sort of angle that will be unique to your specific vantage point. So maybe you're talking more about the use of the depiction of narrative of that, that market square, or maybe the depiction of that River Thames throughout the piece, through the opening and closing musical material. So maybe you're going to put it more in a focus of like narrative and imagery in that piece, versus just doing the analysis of that piece for the 100th time. So I think just trying to be creative and finding different avenues within pieces that have been examined before is really important, rather than just doing an analysis for analysis' sake. And the last thing I'll say is an inherent difficulty of choosing a topic research, certainly that I found, is often the first topics that you explore or consider are way too wide in scope. I think that's really something that happens a whole lot. So it oftentimes, when we first foray into this territory, that scope is too wide, and it sort of lacks a foundational or central focus. So that's part of the challenge, and I think that just going back to that specific individual stance you can take and being creative, I think that's very, very needed.
So after you figure out, or after you go through the process of figuring out your research topic, how do you choose a journal for submission? And can you tell us a little bit about what does peer review mean?
Would you like me to go first, Jason?
Sure.
Okay. Peer, when I was a student in a master's degree and a doctoral degree, I don't think I had any real. I'm pretty sure once I started teaching university life as a college band director, and I never did anything else. I bypassed public school teaching by accident. But even when I started teaching, I wasn't sure what. So I think if you think about instead of gone online or fallen through the cracks somehow, Band World, School Musician, those kinds of publications, and all of the state journals, the Florida Music Educators Journal, the North Carolina Music Educators Journal, and so forth. All of those, none of those are peer reviewed. You can send them any article you'd like, and the editor of the journal or of the magazine or journal makes a decision, and maybe they ask you to make some changes. Maybe they don't. Maybe they like it, publish it as is. Maybe some of them, in fact, rewrite it for you, and then they change your words and everything. It's a little bit funny, but none of those are really peer reviewed. Now, a publication like the Journal of Band Research has been around for a long time, since 1964.
Are you guys having trouble with the connection too?
An article up to 3, and if you send if you're a ed person, you're in a music ed PhD or EDD program, and you send me an article that's a research article, maybe an experimental research, I send it to people who are experts in that, and we have 10 people on our editorial review board, and we cover about all topics: music, band history, band music, and the rest. So we send it out I send it to 3 or 4 people, and they have 3 or 4 weeks to read it and review it, and they all send me a very detailed review of what they think. They'll tell me what they like, they'll tell me what they don't like, they'll make suggestions, and often they'll ask questions of the author about, well, what did you mean here, or what did you forget about, and so forth. So then that comes back to me, and sometimes if it's clear cut, if I have 3 or 4 people and they're all thumbs up, this is worthy, but it needs some changes, and that happens often, then I email their comments verbatim to the author. After I ask them to allow 4 to 6 weeks for this to happen, but usually within 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, I email the commentary to the person, and they can see that we're still interested, but we need this, that, and the other addressed specifically, and they'll do that, and they'll redo their paper and send it back for a second time. Also, but if it's like I send it to 4 people and 2 people say sort of moderate thumbs up, and 2 people say no, this is not worthy of publication, and here are the reasons why, then I may ask, I may just turn it down, or I may decide that it could be revised enough to get a second look. But if I get 3 or 4 opinions that the article's not appropriate and it just doesn't really belong in the Journal of Band Research, it doesn't measure up, and here are the reasons why, then we would reject it. But the difference really is a rigorous academic review by real experts versus an editor just says, yes, I think our readers would enjoy this, and I'm not going to fact check it. I'm not going to see if the person who wrote it really did know what they were talking about. And maybe there are a whole lot of just opinions expressed, not real facts, but they were interesting on how to play the trumpet or how to direct a band or whatever it was, and they publish it. So that's the difference. I think the other part of this question is how to choose a journal. I have some things to say here, but let me turn it back to Dr. Naum, and I'll fill in the gaps if you'd like. Is that all right?
That sounds great. Yeah, so I definitely obviously agree with everything that Dr. Locke said. I think everything that he mentioned about peer review is, my understanding. And specifically about the peer review, sort of credibility of peer review in the eyes of those that are paying attention to your scholarly output, I think is significant to mention. And, I think that a lot of answering this question has to do with understanding your motivations for why you're submitting to a given journal, what you're hoping to get out of it. And again, I mean, maybe because I'm firmly in this environment of I'm a faculty member at a major research institution trying to seek tenure, and I'm on that tenure track, and I'm trying to gather evidence, and I always have that in the back of my mind. I know that at my institution, that peer-reviewed journals, refereed journals, carry a little bit more weight and a little bit more credibility in my tenure dossier. So I think a lot of it has to do with knowing what your school or institution values in terms of tenure review or promotion, and kind of centering some of your efforts within your publication profile or dossier towards that end. Some institutions might value volume. Just get yourself out there, a number of different avenues, whether it's peer reviewed or not. But others put more weight on the refereed journals. So it really has to do with what your motivations are and your institution's expectations of you. Obviously, I think in terms of the band field, the ABA Journal of Band Research is, in my mind, and I'm sure Dr. Locke would agree, is really at the top of the list. I mean, it is the premier, probably the most credibly significant journal out there in our field. So that carries with it a good deal of weight in the eyes of many. So I also think that in the eyes of your peers, and as you're maybe even applying to jobs, it's not just about tenure reviews, but as you apply to jobs, those certain publications do carry, as I mentioned, varying kind of weights within the profession. Dr. Locke, anything that I'm forgetting or you can add to?
No, I think you're right on track. The part of this question was about choosing a journal, and really in the academic in the band world are pretty scarce. The Journal of Band Research, I'll beat the drum here for myself, is truly the leader and has been for a long time. There are two more. However, neither of them are published in print these days that I can tell. One is the WASB Journal, the World Association of Symphonic Bands and Ensembles. It was begun in 1994. Usually came out with one issue per year. And it can be peer reviewed. At least it was until a couple of years ago. And I'm not quite sure what they do now, but in the old days, they would offer you the opportunity to have peer review, or they had a second tier called editorial review, in which the editor, who for a long time was William Bertz, B-E-R-Z, at Rutgers, wonderful guy and a wonderful writer and scholar, and he would review it and just himself, and if they wanted to publish it, they did, and it was sort of in a kind of a second category that's a little unusual. The other is the CBDNA journal, which was begun in 1984. And it's had an odd history. In its first, it was begun in 1984, and over the next 17 years, they published 14 journals. One a year, sort of, but there were some years that they didn't come out with anything. And there's some very fine articles in there. They're also about impossible to find unless you can locate someone, maybe a professor at your school, who has back copies of them, because they didn't do a very good job of getting them put on to services like Realm or EBSCO and all of the online journals. A few of them are there. Most of them are hard to find. And now the CBDNA, if you go to the CBDNA website, you'll see there is a journal, and it's an online journal, but it must not be very popular, because in 1917 and 18 and 19, in each of those 3 years, they had one article in each year, and it's online at an outfit called Sage, S-A-G-E, Sage Publications. And you can get to Sage Publications through the CBDNA website, and it'll show you how to submit an article, and that is an option for you. There's no print journal like with ABA, Journal of Band Research, but it will be online. And those 3 articles that have been listed online since CBDNA went to the Sage Publications and totally online, they're good articles, and you can access them for free through Sage, which is a good thing. Now, there are a whole bunch of music ed journals that are peer-reviewed, and I'll just go over probably some of these names you'll know, most of them I would expect. The Journal of Research in Music Education, the Music Educators Journal, MEJ, the Bulletin for the Council on Research and Music Education, the CRME Bulletin, that's at the University of Illinois, Update, Applications of Research in Music Ed, the International Journal of Music Education, which is part of ISME, if you know, the International Society for Music Education, Research Studies in Music Education. There are a lot of them. The only other thing I would add, and Dr. Nam was talking about this, about being, in his case, at a major research university and needing in his portfolio the expectation of publication for promotion and tenure. I must say that in our profession, if you've never heard this before, you're going to hear it here first. In the band world, in the collegiate band world, of which many of you are in now as students, and many of you hope are tuning in, are faculty members, collectively, we are a very non-publication-oriented bunch of people. The people who publish scholarly articles among card-carrying college band directors is tiny. We don't write very many articles, and we don't have very many scholars. I think generally there are a lot of people who become very, very successful and very famous and are wonderful conductors and rehearsers, and they moved up through the ranks and were promoted and tenured just based on that they conducted well, they built a band program, they went out and did the all-state bands around the country, and they did guest conducting, and they conducted community bands and military bands and all of that, and gave presentations at the Midwest Convention and at state music educators conventions. But there are a whole lot of really, really fine, talented people who've never written a thing. And it's kind of a pity, but we're just sort of non-scholarly. We just are. That's all there is to it. I wish I could change it, but, and I'm hoping that your generation, all you new, bright people like Isaac Brinberg and Angie Hamada, I hope their generation will right the ship for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to bring up. That I think that there are certain characteristics of our profession that are just like you're describing, Dr. Locke, but the mindset of, as I mentioned before, each institution is so different. And at a large institution, you're not only sending your tenure file up through the School of Music or your department. At some point, eyes get on it that are maybe someone in a biology department or some upper administrator, where they don't really, I mean, they care, but they care more about what's quantifiable, what's print journals, print scholarly articles, things that are more in line with what other areas of the campus do. And so I think mindsets might shift a little bit more as time goes on, as as the scrutiny kind of changes for us all in higher education. I would also mention a couple journals. There's the NBA journal, National Band Association, of course. I believe they either resurrected that, or it's been around for several years now in its current form. And I think Russ Gavin was editor of that for some time. But there's an editorial review process with that. I don't know if they call it peer review, but that it certainly kind of takes on those characteristics. Dr. Locke mentioned the WASB journal, and that's certainly more of an internationally based journal. There's also the IGEB, which is the International Society for Research and Promotion of Wind Music, that I know that some of my colleagues in the profession have kind of looked towards recently, and their publication is called Alta Musica. So that's definitely another kind of internationally based journal publication. And I mentioned international, and largely the ones we have been talking about are kind of US based. So another thing to consider is the audience, whether it's going to be regional, national, or international. So just another thing to think about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the call for wanting to continue publishing and to build scholarship in our field. That's incredibly important. Thank you for providing so many outlets for that as well. So specifically on the journal band research, what are the typical parameters for submitting a manuscript? What are some of the characteristics and attributes and things to look for as a writer?
Okay. The parameters for submitting to the Journal of Band Research, I'll go over them in sort of short form, but let me give you our website. The journal is very easy. journalofbandresearch.org, O-R-G, journalofbandresearch.org. And there's a how to submit tab there. And it will tell you that you email a Word file of your manuscript. We'd like to see it in Times New Roman 12 point. You have the choice of following the Turabian style manual or the APA style manual. If probably you're doing a music ed study, you'll want to use APA or have been used to that. We like end notes, and of course, you also, even in Turabian, as well as, of course, you do in APA, use the author date system for your citations. You need to use one of those two very common style manuals and just be consistent with it. You would provide us with your own contact information. You'd send us a 200-word or less biographical sketch about yourself. And by submitting your article, your manuscript to us, you are in effect saying that it has not been published before and you're not currently in the same time frame submitting it elsewhere for consideration. And you'll get an email back from me right away within a day or two that I've gotten it, and that it'll probably take 6 or 8 weeks before you get some kind of a judgment from us. And on that, I'll go ahead and mention, we have, and sometimes after people have published in the Journal of Band Research and they're going up for tenure or promotion, they'll write back and say, well, what is your acceptance rate? And during the 12 years that I've done this, our acceptance rate is around 30 to 35%. And almost 100% of that 30 or 35% are articles or manuscripts that we send back to the author for at least some minor revision or maybe some pretty substantial revision or answering of questions that we have. We rarely ever, I think maybe twice, maybe 3 times in my 12 years, have we gotten an article that was so good we just threw up our hands and said, this is fantastic. It's going straight to the journal. No questions asked. That's an exception. So that's sort of the quick answer on this number 3 question. And I don't know if Jason may have something to add because he's published with us and he's a very, very fine scholarly writer.
Thank you, Dr. Locke. Yeah, I have a couple things, and it speaks a little bit towards, of course, JBR, but also just some things to keep in mind for other journals. Maybe it's the NBA journal, maybe it's the CBDNA. But really, at the end of the day, whichever journal you submit to, just make sure that you very, very closely read this very specific guidelines for how to prepare your manuscript. Because while there will certainly be lots of commonalities between the different journals, all it takes is those few line items that you neglect that presents a problem down the road. So just make sure that, I know at the some years back when I submitted to the NBA journal that they they were particular in wanting like a cover page with, you know, my name omitted from the manuscript to allow for like a blind review. You know, you just want to pay attention to those very, you know, detailed particulars. I should also say, and this was certainly the case for, as Dr. Locke mentioned, a publication I sent over to Dr. Locke for the JBR. It was a paper based on the music of Igor Stravinsky. And so I really had to make sure that I obtained the necessary permissions to include any and all music examples. And as I'm sure many of you know, Stravinsky's music being sort of under lock and key with Boozy and Hawks, that's a lengthy process at times. So I would reach out to publishers early and in the process and make sure that you kind of allow for that time, because you never know, there might be some contentious issue with permissions and copyright. So start that process early.
So when going through the peer review process, what are some typical comments that reviewers provide to authors? And Dr. Nam, I know you touched upon this a little bit. What are some strategies for applying the comments of reviewers?
Yeah, I guess I can lead things off. You know, I can only speak to my experience. I think, as Dr. Locke alluded to, the types of comments that are sent are, you know, kind of centered around maybe like reorganizing things or asking questions or asking for, you know, perhaps strengthening a particular argument. And that's certainly my experience. And, you know, some comments might just simply address or compliment or critique the quality of the writing and language used itself, you know, in terms of the tone that's struck in a certain academic paper. You know, assessing the use or the types or the effectiveness of the use of sources, like, you know, do you have primary sources? Are you using mostly secondary sources? Maybe even kind of some comments about the originality of a thesis, or maybe the lack of originality of a thesis. So kind of causing you to go back to the drawing board a little bit. You know, they might ask for more evidence to support an argument, as I mentioned. You know, maybe that there's extraneous information. Certainly it was the case with me. I had to, in the review, trim a lot of fat and kind of really hone in on the topic and focus. So, and that's, you know, not uncommon. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like applying those comments, I can say from a standpoint of an author, as we can all probably sense, the review process can sometimes feel kind of painful and you feel very vulnerable and it can be very nerve-wracking. But, you know, I think that comes from the fact that as an author, it's difficult to have a purely objective frame of mind because you've really spent a lot of time with this subject or this topic. So in that way, I think even before you send the manuscript for review or that initial sending to a journal like JBR, it's useful to have colleagues or friends read through your manuscript and provide just that objective level of feedback, people that you know you can trust. But you know, even when you do get that feedback from a journal like, say, JBR or CBDNA or whoever else, you know, obviously read the comments. You know, read every last comment. Find the common points of criticisms among the different reviewers, and then just determine what needs to be changed and what needs to be retained. And it seems silly and simplistic to say that, but I mean, that is the process. In an argument thesis-based paper, obviously you're always kind of looking for, and indeed a lot of the comments can tend to be whether or not you are making connections back to your central thesis. And you know, you might be successful to varying degrees with that throughout the paper. Maybe you're wandering a little bit from the topic and you need to kind of hone back in. You know, and I also should say that you should be ready to defend, or more so provide clear rationale for the inclusion or retaining an aspect of your paper if they provide comments that say, you know, this isn't making sense here, I think this is extraneous. Maybe if you provide that rationale and you really explained your mindset with that, then you know, you can come to the middle a little bit in a way, especially if you feel like evidence that you're providing or parts of your writing really do need to stay there. So, you know, there's a little bit of an ebb and flow to it, I think. You know, but, you know, as Dr. Locke said, this is a panel of experts, leading experts in the field. So, I mean, I think it's a good idea to listen to the comments and apply as much as you can. Dr. Locke.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
I have
sure.
a number of, this was probably my longest answer, at least my longest outline of an answer. I think typical comments, I think sometimes the topic itself or the premise itself of the paper can be a problem. Sometimes an author has tried to connect dots out there in the universe that don't very easily connect. And the reviewers will point that out. Sometimes we have to say, why didn't you cite so-and-so or so-and-so's research? And then I've seen reviewers say, clearly, you don't know what exists already on this topic. And that's going to sting a little bit if you get that in your review, but that's a part of why we're here, I guess. Then sometimes some authors spend too much time on things that we already know and almost everyone knows. Sometimes in a paper, you might do, if you have a 6-page bio on William Schumann in your submission, I'm sure some of my reviewers are just going to say, come on now, we all know this. The mention of the bio of William Schumann could be 1 paragraph, not 6 pages. I think that some people sometimes rely way too much on one source. We had to turn something down recently that was really pretty well written, but it was a paper about a particular person, a particular band director, and nearly the entire paper relied on that person's own autobiography. And so it was just, well, if this person said it, it must be true, and now I'm passing it along. And that was the main source for the whole paper, which was a problem. And I think this one can be huge, that your manuscript is largely a reordering of many already well-known facts. Earlier, I said what you're working on has to move the needle of what we don't know. And I think that's really important. You've got to add something to our knowledge of whatever field or whatever topic you're approaching, not just cite half a dozen books. The citing half a dozen books and writing it really well and using wonderful grammar and syntax and the citations are all good. That's great for your master's term paper for band lit class. Okay, that isn't going to get you in the Journal of Band Research. So you've got to come up with something that the world doesn't know too much about. In the music ed topics, and we get a lot of music ed papers, research studies, experimental research. Sometimes we have the problem of, as often is the case in someone's dissertation, of researcher bias. Sometimes the sample size is too small, the number of students in the group that you were examining. Sometimes you use the wrong statistic, the wrong statistical treatment, and I've got people that will just jump all over that and tell you exactly what statistics you should have done. And sometimes your results and your conclusions go way outside the realm of believability, and suddenly, because you took 12 kids in this junior high and 12 kids in this junior high and compared method A with method B, and now you say to the world, I'm absolutely certain that using method A is going to be the best thing ever for everybody, the world around, then somebody's going to hit the gong on that one. And then also, if you're doing an experiment of any kind or using human subjects, our reviewers will quiz you about your if you've had an IRB review. And I don't have time to go into that now, but just Google IRB review if that's new to you. And it shouldn't be if you've been in grad school, but we will ask about that. Sometimes we even get papers with bad grammar and people who don't know how to do a block quotation, and spelling errors and all that. And so that's kind of embarrassing. And as Dr. Nam said, you really should, once you write something, you should show it to several people. You should have people go through it with a fine-tooth comb before you send it to us. Sometimes we have musical examples that are fuzzy looking or they're crooked on the page, and have people scribble marks like you just took a score that you marked up and you just slapped it on the Xerox machine and cut this little snippet out or scanned it, and it looks horrible and it's not straight. And And as Dr. Nam said, we have this problem all the time. You wouldn't think we would, but we get people who send these things in that are under copyright, and they've made no attempt yet to get the copyright permission. And if you do copyright permission, it's not just like you put that as a letter in your appendix. Every single example that you have has to say copyright Boozy and Hawks Incorporated, permission granted, and I mean the date of the copyright, and that used by permission. And that's going to be on every single one. So if you've got 6 or 8 little examples, that whole little paragraph has to be printed in your paper under each one. So that's important. And sometimes the copyright can take time. It can even cost you some money. They may charge you $50. They might charge you a couple $100. I don't see why they do, because I think that just by publishing in the JBR would be a boon to their being able to sell more copies of their piece. Another one that comes up now and then, and I learned this a long time ago, that try not to psychoanalyze the dead. Now, that seems a little silly, but sometimes people will write, if you're writing about Holst, and don't, because there's a whole lot of material, great material out there about Holst. I think Frederick Fennell was a wonderful Holst scholar. And then, in fact, one of my classmates back in the Stone Age at the University of Illinois, John Mitchell, is maybe the Holst scholar, and has published in the JBR and the early CBDNA journals, wonderful articles. But don't try to go back and tell me why it was that Holst did this or that and the other if you don't have some real tangible evidence to point to. All right, that would be about my contribution on that question.
Dr. Locke, would you mind, or I guess Isaac and Angie, would you mind if I share my screen real quick? Do I have the capability to do that?
I'm going to jump in real fast. I'm not sure if you do have the capability to do that.
Okay, that's fine. I was just going to show what a sample of like the publisher's letter for authorization looks like, but I guess if anyone's interested in seeing what that looks like, you can just message me.
Yeah, thank you if you're willing to share that. I think that'd be a great resource for people to see. So going along, what do you do when a manuscript is accepted or rejected? So after you get reviewer comments and you apply reviewer comments and you resubmit it to the journal for consideration?
I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward here, at least with the notes that I wrote down. If you're accepted, then just listen and watch for the next steps as indicated by the editor, someone like Dr. Locke, and or whoever you're corresponding with during the review process. And I think if you're rejected, again, spoken from the standpoint of an author, that perspective, first of all, don't panic. It's not the end of the world, right? And just sort of, you have to kind of learn how to be objective about that, as I've mentioned before. Certainly just try to regroup, revise your paper, try to get some additional feedback from some colleagues, from some friends that you trust, and then you move on, like psychologically too, because it can be a big hit to your ego. That it's important to remember that you're not a failure. It might even be for a very general reason or rationale, like maybe the scope or topic of your choice was just simply not appropriate for the particular audience of a journal, and it's a learning experience. Maybe the next time around you try to fashion a topic that's a little bit more fitting, and then maybe reassess a more appropriate venue. So I mean, those are a couple, however obvious, things that I would think of. Dr. Locke, anything else there?
I agree. In fact, I had those same words. I said, yes, it will hurt, be rejected, but learn from it and move on. And you can always, if you're rejected from us, there are other possible outlets, and you could deal with what we said caused the rejection, and rewrite and resub. If we didn't want to see it again, you could try some of the other publications around the country or around the world which are less stringent, and you may very well have a chance to get it published. In our case, if it is accepted, there's a bit of a wait. We maintain a pretty healthy backlog of articles, and if you sent me something today and it worked its way through the process and got published, and we were interested in publishing it, we'd probably be looking at the fall issue of 20. We'd probably be thinking about an issue possibly in 2022 for it to come out. Maybe the fall of 2021 right now. There might be a couple spots left, but we maintain a pretty healthy backlog also. Isaac or Angie, do you think we might be able to get to some of those extra questions, 2, 3, or 4?
Yeah, sure thing. I actually am really curious about the last 2 questions that we had for you, and I know you've kind of already shared some of your thoughts on this. The first one is, are there certain research topics or areas that you would like to see submitted to the Journal of Band Research? And following up with that, where do you think Win Band scholarship is heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I heard the second question. Repeat the first one.
Sure. Are there certain research topics or areas that you would like to see submitted to the Journal of Band Research?
Yes. And where are we in 5 to 10 years? Let me talk about the possible topics for the future. I absolutely love topics that involve band history, and we get far too many articles, manuscripts that deal with that. There aren't very many band historians out there, or maybe people who are interested in it or have the chops, so to speak, to be good at it. I want to tell you about an article, and I wish I could get more like this. I think in my 12 years, this is the very, very best article, manuscript, that we've ever published. And it's also the longest. It's maybe 50 pages, which is double the length of most of our submissions. And I mentioned the Journal of Band Research.org website. And if you go there, and there are multiple pages, and it's easy to navigate. And there's a link that will take you to what we call, it's brand new this spring when COVID hit and I was shut in totally. And I had a little help with this. We launched the JBR store, and it will link you to the JBR store at our website, where you could download, you could purchase this article for the ridiculously low cost of $3. And I think it's just an absolutely fantastic article. And it's written by Dr. J. Michael Raley, R-A-L-E-Y, of Hanover College. And he's since writing this, I put him immediately on our editorial review board. And it's just a fascinating history story. It's called Ernest, and I bet none of you have heard of this at all, Ernest E. Lyon, L-Y-O-N, and the Pi Kappa Omicron Fraternity Band Music Commissioning Project at the University of Louisville, 1949 to 1958. And this reads like a novel. It is the most fascinating article I've ever seen published in our journal. And it's the story of, this is right after World War II, and there were some older, wiser students in the music program at Louisville, and they formed a band fraternity, and they began a commissioning project with the fraternity. They played gigs with a little dance band, and they turned that money into commissioning. And they commissioned Vincent Persichetti to write Psalm for Band in 1952. And then the fraternity opened up a publishing company, which was called Picaron Publishing. And they invited actually Persichetti to be on the board of the publishing company. And they commissioned Psalm for Band for $200, and somewhere in the fine print, they also said that their publishing company, owned by the fraternity, owned the piece forever. And so it's the whole story of that. They published, they commissioned, William Schumann to write Chester Overture for $250. A band fraternity at Louisville did this. You've got to read this article. It's just the most fascinating tale you've ever heard. And they dealt with Persichetti about 7 or 8 or 9 years later when he realized he didn't own his own piece, or his publishing company didn't, and he had to buy it back from the fraternity, including all the copies. It's just a fantastic thing. But I think where the opportunity now is, and I think this is very timely for the year 2020, I really think that there's a whole area of band history as related to African Americans in the United States that is really untapped. African American conductors and bands, student bands, college bands, factory bands. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, there were some really interesting history articles that we published. One about the prison bands at Sing Sing Prison, which I found really fascinating. Things you just won't encounter anywhere else. There is that that's been published. And there's a wonderful article about one of my heroes, Alton Adams, an African-American band director from the US Virgin Islands, who became the very first African-American military band conductor in his career, and just a wonderful, fascinating story. So I think I would love to see have people write more about the history of the band. There's a whole lot out there, particularly as related to the African American community and other minority communities, and in fact about I think about female band directors the very same. I think there are stories to be told of people that we've rarely ever heard of that had fascinating and successful careers as performers in bands, as conductors of all female bands. So that would be, I mean, maybe it's just me because I like history, but I would like to see something come along in that direction.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That I immediately think of the professional band leader, kind of in the era, if I'm not mistaken, of maybe before Patrick Gilmore in the United States, but Frank Johnson, African American band leader. But yeah, just highlighting certain personalities, certain historical figures, talking about examining their impact on the medium, and as we all know that history is in the hands of those who write it, and I think it's our job to highlight and uplift marginalized voices, and I think another thing that I was thinking about in relation to the final question, where do you think band scholarship is heading in the next 5 to 10 years? I think that we sit at a particularly interesting time in the 21st century, in that, over the first 2 decades of this century, it's really, I've always felt that there's this kind of anxiety behind, talking about or having any sort of retrospective evaluation of certain pieces that have come out, because we don't quite know if those pieces are going to hold and stick and last and stand the test of time. But we're entering into the 3rd decade, so I think that we're at a point in which we can start to look at these really significant works in the 21st century and naturally kind of shed those anxieties about making assessments on the impact of repertoire written, events, performances, or trends in composition in the 21st century. And I would definitely like to echo Dr. Locke's statement of there aren't enough historians in the band field. You think of the Edwin Frankel Goldman, you think of certainly David Whitwell, those seminal texts, Frank Battisti, but it's really up to these younger generations to kind of take up the mantle of that and to kind of begin that process. Speaking to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, as I mentioned, it's our job to lift up these marginalized voices, composers that are underrepresented, composers that are women. And I intentionally put it that way, composers that are underrepresented and composers that are women, because sometimes their identities are wrapped up in these labels, but I think it's important to put the emphasis on the fact that they are composers. They're not just simply some subset or a separate group, right? It's complicated but important. I think the verbiage is important. But just as we repeat performances do much to establish repertoire in a sort of canon, and I always use that word warily. But I think that scholarship and research as well needs to be put into these efforts of writing about these figures, and also having members of these minority groups, women, be highlighted and contribute in their publications and their writing to these various journals, so that they have a voice in making arguments and making assessments of where we stand and where we're going to go in this profession. So I think that we have a lot of work to do, and it's all at once kind of daunting. As myself, someone that's in the first third of his career, but I think that it's also very exciting too, to be on that kind of ground floor of how we might move forward.
I have one thing I wanted to make sure I mention, if that's all right. Is that okay, Angie? Thank you. On the journalofbandresearch.org website, you can click on a link to get to the JBR store. And there are two things you should consider. One, there's a free PDF that you can download of all the articles that have been in the Journal of Band Research, a listing of them in sort of a spreadsheet. It's a PDF, but it's searchable, of all 610 articles since 1964. So if you go there and you type in Stravinsky, Dr. Nam's article, among others, will pop up. Or if you type in Hindemith, all the articles that dealt that in the title had to do with Hindemith will pop up. And it's a really nice resource for you to have, and it's free. The other thing is, if you're not already a subscriber, and this is really the only journal out there that you can subscribe to in the band world, peer-reviewed journal, you can subscribe there, and our price is just ridiculously inexpensive. If you send a check to Troy, Alabama, you need to send a $15 check for a 1-year subscription. If you subscribe at the JBR store, it's $16 because we add $1 for the credit card processing. But it's still, that's for 2 issues a year. It's still quite a bargain, and I hope you'll consider that. Thanks, that's all I had. And let me say also, while I have just a second, my thanks to Isaac Brinberg at Illinois and to Angie Hamada at Northwestern for thinking up this session, and I hope it's been valuable. I know they made it very easy for me, and I think also for Dr. Nam to be involved. And our thanks also to Dr. Carney at UNO for his assistance with all of this. I'm very happy we could have this session. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. And as I opened up with, this is such a rarely touched upon topic, and I think it's really valuable and might help people feel a little less anxious about throwing their hat in the ring, research wise, and write more papers and contribute in this field.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to, I see there's a question in the chat. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this evening, but hopefully maybe you can send that question along the way to our wonderful presenters. First of all, thank you to CBDNA for continuing to host these webinars. I'm sure this is very helpful professional development, and specifically to the Social Media Committee and Dr. Kearney for heading this up and going through this process, and their support is very invaluable in this. Again, thank you to Dr. Nam, Dr. Locke for donating your time and energy in this process, to Angie for being a wonderful co-host in this. I just want to give a shout out to the graduate wind conducting crew, Tina, Weston, and Rob. And we are actually very excited to announce a 2-part transcription series. We posted about this recently, but this 2-part series that we're hosting through our Facebook page, and we'll be sending more information out. But part 1 is going to be a transcription Q&A with Dr. Donald Grantham and Dr. Dennis Ginas, and they're going to be talking about and fielding your questions about the transcription process. Part 2 is going to be involving 2 composers talking about their process transcribing their own works for winds. So again, we'll be posting information about that in the graduate wind conducting group. And the first one is on the 28th at 8:30 Eastern. Watch out for some announcements there.
All right, well, thank you so much. If you'll all please join me in thanking this evening's terrific panelists, Dr. Nam, Dr. Locke, and our moderators, Angie Hamada and Isaac Brinberg. If you haven't yet, definitely check out the Facebook group, Graduate When Conducting. Really an outstanding group. They do such a great job, and maybe I can lobby to even go to those transcription sessions, because those sound fascinating. As a side note, if you are interested in leading a CBDNA webinar, I encourage you to visit cbdna.org. There is a link on the front page of the website that will take you to all of the submission guidelines for the project. Thank you again for joining us. You're welcome to hang out on the Zoom meeting as long as our presenters are happy to stay, but I am going to stop the recording here in just a minute. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you for the next one.